My name is Adam Ventura. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst. I am the founder and CEO of World Evolve, Inc. I am also the co-founder of the Miami Association for Behavior Analysis, and I'm an adjunct professor at Florida International University teaching behavior analysis classes. I'm also the president-elect of the OBM network, and I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about feedback. So this has been a very interesting topic for me over the course of the past couple of years, especially since there's so much research and so much interest into feedback. I thought I'd do a presentation on feedback from a behavior analytics standpoint. So we're going to jump in, and I'm going to share my screen. Unfortunately, while I'm doing the presentation, I won't be able to see the screen. Yes, exactly. Just as the note came out, please leave your questions here if you have any throughout the webinar, and I will get back to them as soon as the webinar ends. Like I said, unfortunately, I won't have access to those questions until the webinar ends. So if you want, leave your questions to the end, or if you don't want to forget them, go ahead and type them in, and I'm going to stay late and make sure to answer any questions. All right, so let's jump right in. Just really quickly, I want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Excellent. Thank you for all the feedback. All right, so the title of the talk is The Function of Feedback, Behavior Analytic Approach to the Analysis and Implementation of Performance Feedback. So I always appreciate this when I watch presentations to see contents or a table of contents at the beginning of the presentation about what we're going to go over so I can keep track along the way. So we're going to talk a little bit about why performance feedback is important, what performance feedback is from a variety of different standpoints, but really focusing on a behavior analytic viewpoint, when to provide performance feedback, where to provide performance feedback, how to provide performance feedback, and one of the most interesting topics, I think, is accepting feedback. So we spend so much time on how to deliver feedback. I think it'd be interesting to have a discussion about how to accept feedback as well. So I wanted to start with a quote about feedback that I felt was germane to this discussion. So the quote is, "Much ambiguity would be eliminated if behavior analysts no longer use the term feedback. It is not a new principle of behavior and does not refer to a specific procedure. It at best has simply become professional slang." When I was doing research on feedback, I found this quote by Norman Peterson in a 1982 article in the Behavior Analyst about feedback, and I found it fascinating and really got me interested in the topic about finding a way to operationally define feedback. And how can we explain that concept behavior analytically? So the question, so that particular question is really the focus of this presentation. So let's start with why feedback, why performance feedback is important. So I found this interesting study by Van Steel et al. In 2012 reported that 65 to 71% of articles published over a 3-decade period in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management used feedback as an independent variable. That's a lot. And came back with over 400 results. And a recent review of Lynda platforms found that over 2,000 courses on a variety of different topics related to feedback were available. I found this fascinating as well. This really indicates that a lot of people are interested in the topic of performance feedback. And then there's a plethora of research in a wide range of applications of feedbacks, from Rose and Ludwig's 2009 study on lifeguard training to Julie Slowiak's telephone customer service and performance feedback in 2008. And then I found an interesting quote as well. Feedback is one of the most cost-effective and consistently used solutions in the OBM literature. And I felt that that was a great way to kind of describe how important feedback is and how often we use it. So an important next question presents itself. What is performance feedback? So let's take some time to talk about the components of performance feedback, and then we'll try to analyze them through a behavior analytic lens. So we'll start by saying there's no agreed upon definition of performance feedback. John Ford noted in a 1980 article in JOBM about feedback classification that a cursory review of the feedback literature reveals a cumbersome and disorganized aggregation of methods and procedures. And this really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that we need a little bit more clarification about feedback and congruence or agreeableness between all of the different professionals that study feedback. And then I did what I do oftentimes when there's a term or phrase that I want to operationally define. I'll take some time, sit down, and look at the dictionary definition. So the dictionary definition defines feedback as the return to the input of a part of the output of a machine, system, or process. Now, this is the definition of feedback, not performance feedback. And what I'd like to talk about here for the next slide or two is a few different definitions that I've found through doing a literature review on the definition of feedback, and then we're going to talk about feedback and performance feedback. But let's start with a very basic definition, which is the dictionary definition that really talks here about a return to the input of a part of the output of a machine, system, or process. I ran across through my literature review a fantastic article by Alvaro, Buckland, and Austin called An Objective Review of the Effectiveness and Essential Characteristics of Performance Feedback. At this particular article, take the time. It is a fantastic article and really gives a lot of perspective on performance feedback in general. So some of the important bullets to take a look at here from this particular article. They noted several other authors' work that is apropos to this discussion, I think, about defining feedback. So one other study that they noted by Prue and Fairbank in 1981 defined feedback as information that is given to persons regarding the quantity or quality of their past performance. Another definition here by Rumler and Brock in 1995 defined feedback as information transmitted back to the responder following a particular performance. So again, talking about a cycle here. And then a separate author of information or a cycle, such as Mueller in 1973 described feedback as information return related to an output. Also in this objective review of the effectiveness and characteristics of performance feedback, they had some interesting information about how people viewed feedback from a behavior analytic perspective. So they noted that Aubrey Daniels in 1994 suggested that feedback is an antecedent. Judith Komaki proposed that feedback is a reinforcer. And then Sulzer, Azaroff, and Mayer believed that feedback could function as a reinforcer, punisher, or even as a discriminative stimulus. So a lot of different ideas here about how well or how feedback operates and how to define feedback in general. I looked into other definitions of feedback and I checked out mechanical engineering, which talked about the 4-process cycle of the engine in a car that involved intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust, and really talked about feedback as a cycle or a loop. in electrical engineering that talked about the process of returning part of the output of a circuit system or device to the input, either to oppose the input negative feedback or to add to the input positive feedback. And then finally, just a quick note on video feedback that involved a loop between video camera input and a video output, like a television screen or a monitor or something like that. So what I really found here was the common theme amongst those examples of feedback is the concept of a loop or a cycle or a return of energy and information. And what it really brought to light was the bidirectionality of the feedback process, the interaction between two entities. So I'd like to touch really quickly on types of feedback. So performance feedback term confusion. When doing research on feedback, I found a lot of different terms out there in the business community. Negative feedback, positive feedback, constructive feedback, corrective feedback, and a lot of, I really felt like these were hotly debated terms, and they used a lot of those words interchangeably, specifically negative feedback, constructive feedback, and corrective feedback. And then when I ran through some of the behavior analytic and some OBM literature in general, I found Manny, Dan, and Shannon's OBM Applied book, and really took some time to go through some of their definitions of feedback. And I think they did a great job of organizing some of those concepts and discussing them in terms of behavior analysis and what it does, what effects it has really on behavior. So what does this all mean from a behavior analytic perspective in general? Let's take a look at some common and proposed definitions of terms related to performance feedback, see if we can kind of unravel this mystery. So two very important articles with regards to performance feedback are Balcazar et al.'s 1985 discussion on performance feedback, and the aforementioned Alvaro, Buckland, and Austin in 2001's kind of comprehensive review of performance feedback. And in Balcazar's 1985 article, he identified 4 characteristics of performance feedback, namely source, mechanism, frequency, and content. When Alvaro, Buckland, and Austin did an update to this and put their article together, they updated these terms by replacing mechanism with medium and adding participants and privacy. And just as a quick heads up, they refer to feedback source as the source referred to the individual or device that presented the information to the performer. And then the feedback medium described the means used to communicate the feedback information to the recipients. Furthermore, feedback frequency, as we all know, the frequency returned to how often feedback was provided to recipients. Feedback participants referred to the people whose performance was described by the feedback. Feedback privacy referred to how widely feedback information was made available. And feedback content identified the type of information provided to the feedback recipients. All right, so now that we've taken a look at some of the existing terms in organizational behavior management with regards to performance feedback, some of those important characteristics, I want to take some time to touch on some other feedback terms and also some proposed jargon to support the previous research that I thought would help us all to understand any prospective definition of feedback. So first, whose behavior is the focus of the analysis? Some of us use terms like learner or behavior. For reasons I will explain shortly, the term I think that best describes the individual whose behavior is the focus of the analysis is the performer. Now, the individual or device that provides the information to the performer, we're referring to as the mediator. I'm going to talk about in a little bit why we're using that term mediator. And an important note to remember here is that this could be an individual or device. And the first device that comes to mind is something like a Fitbit. So Fitbit provides feedback instantly, really, on someone's behavior. So that would be an example of a device that acts as a mediator as part of that feedback loop. Next, Aubrey Daniels and John Bailey in 2014 did a great job, I thought, of defining performance as the behavior, tasks, and results that produce a specific outcome. So as everybody can see here, or I hope you can see, is we're really trying to break down the components of the term performance feedback and really define it operationally. So a proposed definition of just feedback, just the term feedback, would be would be bidirectional information transfer between a performer and a mediator. So information is initially transmitted from a performer to a mediator in one topography and then returned to the performer in a different topography. So this creates kind of a closed loop and illuminates the bidirectional relationship between the performer and the mediator. So the performer engages in the behavior, that information is transferred to the mediator then returns the information to the performer, but using it's structurally different. So the topography of the behavior or the topography of the information when returned to the performer is different. The process is bidirectional because, again, the information is transmitted in both directions. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But information transfer from a performer and to a mediator and back to the performer is considered to be one instance of performance feedback. So that's an important item to note here as well, kind of the difference between a response and a behavior, one instance of the behavior. So I would see information transfer from a performer to a mediator and then back to the performer as one instance of performance feedback. So let's put some of this together. So we created two definitions here, or proposed definitions for performance feedback. So a long definition and then a short definition here. So the long definition, bidirectional information transfer between a performer and a mediator about the behavior, tasks, and results that produce a specific outcome. Or kind of a shorthand version of that same definition, bidirectional information transfer about performance. So if you want to simplify it, we can just say bidirectional information transfer about performance. So performance feedback, important but not enough. So now, and this is very important. Performance feedback is an important part of behavior change, but it's not the entire equation. So in order to change behavior, performance feedback must be paired with a consequence in order to affect change. So for example, providing information about someone's behavior is important, but to produce change in that behavior, the use of some sort of behavioral contingency, specifically, for example, positive reinforcement, in conjunction with that performance feedback is really the best way to improve or change that behavior. So remember, performance feedback is just information transfer, really. What gives performance feedback its power, its utility, is being paired with some sort of consequence. So consequence-based performance feedback is really an intervention package designed to improve performance. And what we did here was we created a proposed definition for consequence-based performance feedback. So I want really everyone to take a look at how we're structuring this, really breaking down the different components. What's feedback, what's performance feedback, and then what is consequence-based performance feedback. So to further support this claim, the aforementioned article, Balcazar et al. 1985, compared feedback alone with feedback and consequences and feedback with goal setting. The results were pretty clear. Feedback alone did not uniformly improve performance, and adding rewards and/or goal setting did improve performance. So again, these are fantastic articles available on JOBM. So if you haven't had a chance to read them, please take some time and go check them out. They're absolutely fantastic articles and will really help you understand how performance feedback works. So let's take a look at this through more of a behavior analytic lens. Although there appears to be no consensus on the behavioral function of feedback, performance feedback can serve as a component in the three-term contingency. So it can serve as an antecedent when it functions as a controlling stimulus, when it alters the probability of an operant. So for example, a discriminative stimulus or an S delta. Feedback can serve as behavior when it is being delivered by a mediator. So depending on your viewpoint, so if you're the person delivering the behavior and you're analyzing your own behavior, then providing feedback is behavior. And then finally, feedback can serve as a consequence when it functions as a stimulus change following behavior. So this is what we were talking about earlier with consequence-based performance feedback. So let's dive a little deeper into the three-term contingency. So when applying the three-term contingency, antecedent, behavior, consequence, feedback first serves as the consequence, as it is the stimulus that immediately follows the behavior. The antecedent stimulus is presented and leads the learner to engage in a response. Following the learner's response, the mediator provides the feedback. This will lead to either the learner continues to engage in the same behavior he or she just performed, or the learner's behavior will change in the future. This is based on the type of feedback that was provided earlier. Furthermore, the consequence, which is the feedback that was presented in the previous trial, will then serve as the antecedent stimulus in the next trial. So to give kind of a visual of this, I couldn't fit this onto the PowerPoint, so I'd like to bring this up really quickly here. So I hope everyone can see this well. So in the first chain, feedback was provided as the consequence. That feedback will then serve as an antecedent stimulus, which leads to the next rehearsal of the targeted response. The outcome of these rehearsal trials is that the learner's behavior will be shaped based on the feedback that is being provided, and once the performance meets criterion, then the learner's behavior will be reinforced through feedback. So I think a really kind of interesting take on performance feedback from the viewpoint of the three-term contingency. All right, so based on all the information presented so far, what are some possible consequence-based intervention packages that can be used? So what I did was I put together, when we talked about how this was going to be structured and the different types of intervention packages, we put together a table identifying some behavior analytic interventions that could use feedback possibly. So hopefully everyone can see the table that I have up here on the screen. And what I did was I highlighted some of the most popular terms that we hear with regards to performance feedback. So if you look at the last column all the way to the right, I put the also known as, because I think some of the information out there, especially outside of behavior analysis and OBM, can be a little confusing. So if you look at the also known as, you see positive feedback, negative feedback, corrective feedback, and constructive feedback. And what we did here was took some time to define this using behavior analytic terms and really the effect on behavior. So if we look at the first one, reinforcing performance feedback, delivered following behavior, increasing desired performance behavior, is also known as positive feedback. The next one that I found out there when we did all of this research was punishing performance feedback. So delivered following behavior, decreasing undesired performer behavior. And this was really referred to as negative feedback through multiple studies. Now, what's important to note here is kind of the difference between negative, corrective, and constructive feedback. The next thing that I want to bring your attention to was pinpointing performance feedback. So precisely describing the desired behavior. So this is providing corrective feedback, where you're specifically identifying what the appropriate behavior would be. And then finally, the last highlighted item that I want to bring your attention to is the use of pinpointing and punishment. So delivered following behavior, decreasing undesired performer behavior, with pinpointing the appropriate behavior. And this is typically referred to as constructive feedback. Now, we also put in a few other combinations of these. So positive and negative feedback together, positive and corrective feedback, and then just what we consider to be a complete feedback package that involved reinforcement, punishment, and pinpointing. Oops. Sorry about that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different conditions in which you provide feedback. So we'll start with, when should we provide performance feedback? Well, the answer is very obvious. So as soon and as often as possible. Don't wait for performance reviews. There was a great article in Harvard Business Review recently published talking about how businesses are now removing annual performance reviews in favor of continuous feedback, conversations, discussions, open dialogues between people in the moment. So just like so many other behavioral contingencies, immediacy is critical. So make sure to provide feedback, whether it's positive, constructive, corrective, whatever it is, as soon as possible. Specifically before the next opportunity to engage in the behavior occurs. So let's look at a few different do's and don'ts with regards to when to provide performance feedback. So some do's: when an employee has performed a task above baseline, when an employee has performed a task to the level that it meets a long-term or short-term objective, when the feedback is needed to evoke a positive change in the employer's skills, when in the past a specific behavior occurred, reinforcement in the form of positive feedback has been delivered. This is where schedules of reinforcement come into play. You'll want to continue to reinforce the employee's behavior to further cement the likelihood that this behavior will occur again in the future. So again, start on a continuous schedule of reinforcement and then titrate your way down to an intermittent schedule. And then finally, for the do's, when the behavior of the employee causes an issue needing immediate attention. So it's very important at that point to provide some sort of performance feedback. Some don'ts: when you don't have all of the information. So I think there's a lot of managers, leaders, supervisors out there that have provided some type of performance feedback without all of the information, without knowing exactly what's happened and what hasn't happened. Usually it ends with bad results. Next, when the feedback is concerning changes that are outside the employee's control. So this is critical. This is a critical part of performance management in general. So you don't want to hold people accountable for behavior that's outside of their control. When the person receiving the feedback is especially emotional or vulnerable. When you do not have the time or patience to deliver the feedback in an effective manner. So if you're tired, if at the end of the day, if you don't have all of the information, these aren't good times to provide performance feedback. When the feedback is based on subjective opinions rather than more effective behavior. So make sure you have all of the information and you're not just a because I said so leader. You don't want to be that type of manager. And then when you have not come up with possible solutions to the behavior. So it's important when you provide feedback to do that pinpointing aspect and identify the specific behavior that they should be engaging in. So let's shift over to where performance feedback should be provided. So just a couple of helpful hints here. Provide feedback in a casual environment. In other words, not your office with a big wooden desk and 2 uncomfortable chairs. A better environment would be 2 chairs set up adjacent to each other without obstacles in between. It helps to lower the tension and anxiety. Positive feedback can be given both privately and publicly. You can mix it up, and what's very important, we're going to talk about a little bit later, is tailoring it to your employees' preferences. And I'm going to talk about this in a few slides, but know your staff, know your followers' reinforcers and preferences. That's really, really important. Typically, we only give corrective or constructive feedback privately. So giving corrective feedback publicly can lead to embarrassment, and they may focus on feeling ashamed rather than the content of your feedback. All right, so the big question, how do we provide performance feedback effectively? So preparation is very important for providing feedback. So one of the first things you need to ask, do you have all of the information? We talked about this earlier. Have you practiced providing feedback appropriately? So providing feedback, like we said earlier, is a behavior exhibited by the mediator, by the manager, by the leader, the person that's delivering the feedback. So if it's a skill like anything else, make sure that you're at least competent, if not fluent, in delivering effective, ethical performance feedback. Identify your staff's reinforcers, identify their preferences. How do people like to be provided with feedback? Do they like to have feedback provided to them often? Do they want feedback to be provided to them in a private setting, in a public setting? Make sure that you know what your employees' preferences and reinforcers are. And then one of the most important things is establishing trust. So I always look at trust as behavior analytically as the congruence between verbal and nonverbal behavior. So really say-do correspondence. When we trust someone, we're much more likely to want to put our best foot forward, and we are all also more apt to trust the feedback they give us. So make sure to establish and maintain trust with the people that you're providing feedback to. So Aubrey Daniels and John Bailey, in their performance management book, put together 10 characteristics of effective feedback. So starting from top to bottom, provide specific information about the behavior and information you're providing, the information about the performance that the performer can control. So make sure, like we said earlier, whatever you're focusing on, make sure the employee can control it. Make sure to provide feedback immediately following the performance, if not during. Make sure, just like all of our other behavioral interventions, that performance feedback is individualized to the person, to the context in which the behavior is occurring. Feedback is best when it's self-monitoring. So I used the example of Fitbit earlier. So if possible, use self-monitoring for performance feedback. If you can't, if performance feedback cannot be self-monitored, then make sure that it's delivered by the immediate supervisor, the person in charge. When providing the performance feedback, make sure to focus on improvement. Focus as much as you can on what the individual can do better. When you provide the feedback, also make sure that it's easily taken in by the individual that you're providing feedback to. So make sure that it's easily understandable. Like so many other behaviors that we want to change, it's important to graph that information. And then feedback functions best when it's an antecedent for reinforcement. So when feedback is an SD, it really helps to improve behavior and performance in the long term. So just some quick helpful tips on how to provide performance feedback. So provide specific reinforcing feedback in a 4 to 1 to 6 to 1 ratio. So that means 4 positive to 1 constructive feedback helps to maintain trust. It lessens anxiety and helps the employee hear the content of your feedback without defensiveness. Something we talk about, so that's really became a problem, and it was something that I learned that was a bad habit when I got into behavior analysis, was using the sandwich method. So positive, negative or constructive, and then a positive piece of feedback. That really provides a lack of clarity on what's going on. So make sure to avoid the feedback sandwich. And then lastly, leave out blame. It's important to not blame anyone and to just focus on improvement. Next, use effective listening. Listen to concerns. Don't jump to conclusions. Listen to all their concerns, regardless of how incorrect or baseless you may think their behavior is. And like I said, refrain from jumping to conclusions or assuming any information. Listening without jumping in will allow for the next step, which is finding points of agreement. During the listening step, look for facts you can both agree on. Using statements like "I hear you," "I understand," will aid in keeping employees relaxed and open. And then lastly, focus on your own contribution to the problem. Don't look for someone to blame. So we talked about this earlier. Understanding contribution is more effective than finding a scapegoat. Very important. Next, keep in mind that everyone's different, and try to come up with solutions to the issue. You don't, like I said before, you don't want to be a "because I said so" type of leader. And then take some time to use behavioral skills training. Role play the new behavior with the employee. Use a combination of modeling and rehearsal to master the skill. Send the employee to practice their skill and check back within a couple of days or a couple of hours maybe. And then try your best to have a conversation. So if you can structure feedback in the form of a conversation or an open dialogue about issues that come up regularly, you'll have a lot more success. So we talked so much about how to provide or how to deliver performance feedback. I don't know that there's enough research out there on how to accept performance feedback. So let's dive into this just a little bit. So accepting feedback is one of the most difficult aspects of a feedback loop where a lot of problems can occur really from both sides. It can cause a lot of issues that arise between both parties if both entities aren't careful, if both the mediator and the performer aren't careful. I think it's important to not only train people how to deliver feedback, but train people how to accept feedback appropriately. So oftentimes as behavior analysts, we work on effective listening skills with the clients that we're working with. The same holds true here with your subordinates and the people that you lead and manage and supervise. You want to make sure that they have the skills to accept feedback appropriately so that performance can improve. So it's really, and this really touches on what I was talking about earlier, where it's a bidirectional relationship between the performer and the mediator, between the person engaging in the behavior of interest and the person delivering the feedback. So why is it difficult? So it's difficult for most people to hear constructive or corrective feedback. And it's difficult oftentimes because you have to work with a variety of different personality types, or in other words, behavioral repertoires. Some important points to remember: don't forget to present the why behind the behavior. Allow for the employees to ask questions and understand its importance. And like I said earlier, most people who deliver feedback receive inadequate training, combined with almost all performers that receive virtually no training on how to accept feedback. So if you're beginning a manager-employee, supervisor-supervisee, leader-follower relationship, I think it's very important to provide training to your follower, to your supervisee, to your employee on how to accept feedback appropriately. And you can really tailor it to your preferences and their preferences. Again, remember, it's important to identify what each individual person's preferences are, what their reinforcers are. So let's take a look at how to accept feedback well. When I was at ABAI earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to meet Rachel Ehrlich. And she's working with a few other people at the BACB on how to define accepting performance feedback appropriately. I'm not sure if her research has been published yet, but I'd strongly recommend to reach out to her. She did a great job and developed a scorecard for determining whether or not somebody's accepted feedback appropriately. So again, she talked about preparation in this article. So when your follower, your employee, your supervisee shows up to receive performance feedback, do they show up prepared? Do they show up with a laptop to take notes on, a notebook to write down important information that you're communicating to them? She also talked about using active listening. So did the performer interrupt you while you were delivering performance feedback? Keep an eye on their body posture. So look out for defensive body postures like crossing arms and looking away. When the mediator was done providing performance feedback and they're done speaking, did they repeat the concern and ask you if you understand correctly? Things like that are all behavioral or ways to identify whether or not somebody has appropriately accepted the feedback. Did they repeat the concerns? Did they confirm their understanding? Did they ask questions about the feedback? So for example, what are the contributing factors to this issue rather than why do you think you're in this situation type of thing? Something else important with regards to accepting feedback is reinforcing the behavior of the person delivering the feedback. So feedback is important, performance feedback is important. So if there's a behavior that's important and we want it to continue, the best way to do that is to use reinforcement. So if you want it to continue, reinforce it. Then create solutions together. So another indicator of accepting feedback well is working on solutions as a team between the person delivering the feedback and the person accepting the feedback. Did they work on solutions together? And then finally, a great way to accept feedback well is to show that is to schedule the next session, to touch base regarding progress towards those particular goals. All right. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I've got all of the references in here. If anyone wants a list of all of these references, please feel free to reach out to me. And then what I wanted to do was leave everyone here with a fun, I guess, meme here of a good episode of performance feedback. We've actually finished maybe about 5 or 6 minutes early. So if you have any questions or want to stick around and discuss anything that we've talked about here in the presentation or performance feedback in general, please feel free. Also, if you want a copy of the PowerPoints or any other information on some of the articles that I found or references, please reach out to me. My email I'm going to put in the message area, adamvent@gmail.com. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time with any questions. And also it will be on the YouTube page as well. Thank you everyone for the great feedback on the performance, very appreciative. And a lot of people have been talking about accepting feedback. Like I said, I was really inspired to talk about accepting feedback. Oh, let me put that in there. I just put my email into the message area, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. But again, I was really inspired to touch on accepting feedback really after two things. Manny Rodriguez wrote a great article on accepting feedback on behavioral science in the 21st century. So take a look at that when you get a chance. And then when I met Rachel at ABAI, she really inspired me to dive in a little more into accepting feedback and really looking at both sides of the feedback equation. Thank you again, everyone.